Across the world, strange and unexplainable phenomena began to emerge, phenomena that seemed to warp the very fabric of time. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly, with subtle shifts in the flow of everyday life. People would experience moments that felt oddly familiar, like déjà vu, but not in the usual sense. It wasn't just the fleeting sense of repetition that often accompanies déjà vu, but something far deeper, more profound. It was as if the present was slipping into the past, and the past was slowly re-emerging into the present. The world, it seemed, was on the verge of experiencing something far beyond human comprehension. In cities bustling with life, moments from the past appeared to play out in real time, as if history itself was looping back streets that once witnessed tragic events seemed to echo those tragedies, reawakening the memories of those who had lived them. People unknowingly found themselves walking through their own histories, reliving the moments they thought they had long since left behind. The more this occurred, the more the world's inhabitants began to feel as though they were caught in a cycle they couldn't escape. These moments, these odd recurrences of the past, were not just limited to a few isolated incidents. They began to spread, growing in intensity and becoming too frequent to ignore. People who once felt time as a constant and predictable force now found themselves at the mercy of an ungraspable tide. No one could explain why it was happening, and no one knew how to stop it. It wasn't just the recurrence of moments that was disturbing. There were also cases where people encountered experiences they had never lived through. A man might find himself walking through the exact same street he had passed just hours before, but this time he was walking it as if for the first time, seeing things he could not remember seeing, before feeling as though he had never walked there before at all. The experience was disorienting, unsettling, and utterly inexplicable. It was as if time had reversed itself, allowing individuals to briefly step into their own past, but not in a linear fashion. They were experiencing what they knew to be their past, but as if they had never lived through it before. There was a growing sense of unease that began to spread across the world. People were beginning to question what was real and what had always been real. Was the world they lived in still the same world they had known? Had something happened to the very essence of time itself? These questions lingered in the air unanswered, and with every passing day, the strange events began to intensify. In some places, the effect was localized to a small area, but in others it affected entire cities. Entire blocks of people would experience the same déjà vu, the same uncanny sense of the past creeping up around them. Some people embraced it, wondering if it was a gift, a glimpse into a more meaningful version of reality. Others were frightened, fearing that something had gone terribly wrong, that the very fabric of time itself was unraveling, and they were caught in the center of it. No one, however, could deny the overwhelming sense that the world was changing irrevocably, and that the changes were tied directly to the flow of time itself. As the incidents grew more frequent, the media began to take notice. News outlets first reported the phenomenon as strange occurrences, just anomalies, nothing more. But as the days wore on and more people reported similar experiences, it became clear that this was no ordinary case of déjà vu. The world had become a stage for something far stranger, far deeper, and far more inexplicable than anyone had anticipated. Scientists, journalists, and even governments scrambled to find an explanation. They suggested that the strange occurrences might have been caused by a global phenomenon of some sort, perhaps a scientific anomaly or an unexplained physical event that was affecting the perception of time. But the truth was, no one had the answers, and no one could predict where it was going. People began to adjust to the phenomenon in different ways. Some tried to ignore it, moving on with their daily lives, hoping that it would pass. Others began to document the moments, collecting records of these strange events, hoping to find some meaning or pattern in the chaos. But no one seemed to have any answers. Time itself, as they had always understood it, was no longer reliable. It was no longer predictable. It was, in a sense, broken. And the most unsettling realization of all was that no one could figure out why. No one knew what had caused the rupture in the flow of time, and no one knew how to fix it. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the strange occurrences persisted. In some cases, the effects of the anomalies grew more intense, with people experiencing entire days or weeks from the past, unfolding before them as though trapped in a time loop. The world was no longer a place where the past was just a memory. It had become a place where the past, present, and future collided, and where time no longer adhered to the rules it once had. The strangest part was that those experiencing these moments didn't even recognize they were trapped in them. They went about their daily lives interacting with people they thought were real but who weren't. They relived conversations they had already had, actions they had already taken, as though there was no difference between the past and the present. The more these strange incidents unfolded, the more it became apparent that the world had crossed into an unknown territory where time was no longer linear and where the consequences of past actions were playing out in ways no one could have anticipated. The lines between what had happened and what was happening now began to blur, and the boundaries of time began to dissolve. No one knew how this would end, or if it would ever end at all. One thing, however, was certain. The world was no longer the same, and whatever force was at work in the background, manipulating time, was far more powerful and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Time had become an enigma, and the future of humanity was tied to the very fabric of time itself. A sense of unease was spreading across the globe as the strange and inexplicable events continued to unfold. People were experiencing moments in time that seemed to loop back on themselves, and the world began to shift in ways no one could explain. As the phenomena grew more widespread, Dr. Evelyn Carter, a renowned quantum physicist, was called upon to lead a team of researchers to investigate the anomalies. Her reputation for solving complex problems and her deep knowledge of the fundamental laws of physics made her the ideal candidate for such a mysterious and unsettling task. Evelyn assembled a team consisting of experts in various fields, including Daniel Voss, an aerospace engineer with a focus on time manipulation, Jonathan Price, a data analyst and mathematician, and Samuel Reed, a theoretical physicist who specialized in the nature of time itself. Together, they formed a group that would delve deep into the fabric of time, seeking answers to questions that had never before been asked. The first clue that something was amiss came when the team began to analyze the increasing number of strange occurrences. What they found was unlike anything they had encountered before. Time itself appeared to be bending and warping in ways that defied logic. Using advanced equipment designed to measure the passage of time, they observed anomalies in the flow of temporal energy. These anomalies, however, weren't random. They followed a pattern that seemed to grow more complex the deeper they investigated. Each time an event occurred, the pattern became more evident. It was as though time was being manipulated by an unknown force, one that was not bound by the laws of physics as they understood them. At first, Evelyn and her team assumed that the anomalies might be the result of a malfunction in their equipment, but after recalibrating their instruments and reanalyzing the data, they were forced to confront a chilling reality. The anomalies weren't due to any technical failure. They were real. Time was actually shifting in ways they couldn't explain. The strange phenomena they had been hearing about, people reliving past moments, events happening out of order, and memories that didn't seem to belong to the present, were a manifestation of something far larger at play. The first major breakthrough came when the team focused their efforts on the digital archives of major cities, hoping to find a correlation between the temporal disturbances and the data that had been recorded during those events. Jonathan Price, using his background in data analysis, uncovered an odd pattern in the timestamps attached to every video recording in data entry. These timestamps were inconsistent. They seemed to shift, sometimes moving forward in time, other times slipping backward, as if they were being altered in real time. This discovery confirmed what the team had feared. Time itself was being manipulated. Evelyn stood at the forefront of the investigation, piecing together the clues. Each anomaly seemed to be linked to a specific point in history, a point that was out of place in the natural flow of time. But there was one crucial question that remained unanswered. Who or what was causing this disturbance? The team's next step was to trace the source of these anomalies. And the more they dug, the more they realized that the answer might lie beyond the confines of Earth itself. There were inconsistencies in the records, both past and present, that hinted at an external force, something or someone that was manipulating time on a scale much larger than anything they had ever imagined. As the team conducted more tests and gathered more data, they came to a startling conclusion. The anomalies were not a random occurrence. They were part of a deliberate, calculated interference in the natural flow of time. The force behind these disturbances was something far beyond their current understanding. Evelyn and her team could no longer deny the possibility that they were dealing with an entity, whether alien, technological, or something else entirely, that had the power to manipulate time itself. The next phase of their investigation involved locating the point of origin for these disturbances, and it quickly became clear that the source of the interference wasn't from within Earth's atmosphere. Their instruments began to pick up strange signals coming from the deep reaches of space. These signals were unlike anything that had been recorded before, and they appeared to be connected to the same disturbances that were plaguing Earth's. Samuel Reed, with his knowledge of quantum physics, theorized that the signals were somehow opening a window to a different plane of existence, one where time wasn't bound by the same rules they had come to understand. This theory was both thrilling and terrifying. If time itself was being manipulated from an external source, then the very nature of reality could be in danger. As the team continued to study the signals and the temporal anomalies, they began to notice something even more unsettling. These disturbances weren't just happening randomly, they were occurring in patterns, and these patterns seemed to be growing more complex and more frequent. Evelyn realized that the phenomena they were witnessing were just the beginning of something much larger. The temporal fabric of the universe was being unraveled, and the cause was something far more powerful than they had ever imagined. The idea that time could be manipulated on such a massive scale raised questions about the very nature of existence itself. Could time be controlled by a force outside of their understanding? Could the laws of physics be bent to the will of an unknown entity? And if so, what were the consequences of such power? Evelyn knew that if they were going to uncover the truth behind these strange events, they would need to think beyond the boundaries of what was scientifically possible. They were no longer just trying to understand a scientific anomaly. They were now facing a phenomenon that challenged the very core of reality itself. Their investigation had become a race against time, not just to uncover the source of the disturbances, but to prevent the destruction of time itself. With each passing day, the world seemed to drift further from the reality they had once known. The anomalies were no longer limited to small, isolated incidents. They were beginning to affect entire cities, entire regions. People were losing track of time, and some were even beginning to forget parts of their own lives, as though the timeline of their existence was being altered before their very eyes. Evelyn and her team were now in a race against an unseen force, one that was determined to rewrite the fabric of time. What they didn't know yet, however, was that the source of these disturbances wasn't just manipulating time, it was shaping the very future of humanity, and the consequences of their investigation would soon become far more personal than they could have imagined. The deeper they delved, the more they realized they weren't just investigating a scientific phenomenon. They were uncovering a far-reaching conspiracy, one that threatened not only the timeline of the Earth, but the very existence of life as they knew it. As Evelyn and her team delved deeper into the strange anomalies affecting the fabric of time, they began to uncover something even more unsettling. They had initially assumed that the disturbances were limited to the perception of time itself, but soon discovered that the very structure of space-time was being altered. Using advanced instruments that measured the behavior of fundamental particles, they found something extraordinary. The particles that made up the very building blocks of matter were not behaving as they should. The measurements indicated a fundamental disruption in the way space and time interacted with each other. Normally, particles would scatter in predictable ways when subjected to certain conditions, but in the affected areas, the behavior was erratic and inconsistent. The particles seemed to be shifting in ways that defied all known laws of physics. At first, the team was unsure what to make of the data. It was unlike anything they had encountered in their years of research. The results were so contradictory to the well-established models of quantum mechanics that they couldn't ignore the possibility that they were witnessing an unprecedented shift in the laws of the universe itself. It was as though the very foundation of reality was beginning to crack. As the team conducted more tests, they found that the disturbance was not limited to a single location. It was a global phenomenon affecting regions across the planet and even extending into the depths of space. The anomalies were scattered across the world, but in each case the particles exhibited the same strange behavior. The more they studied the data, the more they realized that these disturbances were not simply random fluctuations, but were part of a larger pattern The particles were moving in ways that seemed deliberate, as if they were being manipulated by some unseen force. What's more troubling was that the disruption didn't seem to be a localized event. It was as if the very laws of quantum mechanics were being rewritten in real time. The fundamental particles that made up all matter were no longer following the rules they had for millennia. In certain areas, the particles would become disordered and chaotic, and then suddenly snap back into a more stable state before the process began again. In other regions, the particles would scatter in all directions, as though they were being pushed and pulled by some external force. It was as if the universe itself was in the process of remaking its own rules. Evelyn and her team were astounded by the implications of these findings. If the fundamental laws of physics were being altered, it could mean that the entire structure of reality was in flux. The consequences of this were impossible to predict. If the very particles that made up the universe could be manipulated, then the possibilities for what could happen next were limitless. Could the laws of gravity be changed? Could time itself be bent further out of shape? They didn't know, but what they did know was that the disturbance was growing stronger. The anomalies were becoming more frequent and more intense as the team continued to collect data. The behavior of the particles was becoming more erratic and unpredictable. There was no telling when the next shift would occur or what the next disturbance would bring. One of the most unsettling discoveries was the realization that these changes in the behavior of particles weren't just happening in isolated regions. The disturbances were spreading. They were beginning to overlap and merge, creating areas where the laws of physics seemed to break down entirely. In these regions, the very fabric of space-time seemed to warp and stretch as though the universe itself was tearing apart at the seams. As the team examined the data more closely, they realized that the disturbances were not only affecting the fundamental particles, but also the larger structures of matter. The gravitational fields that held planets and stars in place were becoming unstable. The fabric of space-time itself was stretching and contracting in ways that were not possible under normal circumstances. The implications of this were chilling. If the laws of physics were no longer consistent across the universe, it could mean that reality itself was on the brink of collapse. The very existence of stars, planets, and even the concept of time itself could be in jeopardy. As the anomalies continued to grow stronger and more widespread, Evelyn and her team were faced with a terrifying realization. The disruptions in the behavior of the fundamental particles were not just random fluctuations, they were the result of an external force, a force that was manipulating the very structure of the universe. The team had only begun to scratch the surface of what was happening, but they knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary scientific anomaly. They were dealing with something far more dangerous and far more profound than they could have ever imagined. As they continued to collect data and analyze the patterns, they began to see a larger picture emerging. The disturbances were not just affecting the particles themselves, but were rippling out through the entire universe. The very fabric of space-time was being manipulated by an unknown entity or force that was somehow bending the laws of nature to its will. The question now was, what was the purpose behind this manipulation? What was the force behind these changes? Was it trying to reshape the universe, or was it something far more destructive? The team didn't know, but the evidence was mounting. Something was out there in the depths of space manipulating the very nature of reality. It was a force that no one had ever encountered before, and it was becoming clear that it had the power to reshape everything. Evelyn and her team knew that they were on the edge of a discovery that could change everything. But with every new revelation, the danger grew. The laws of physics were no longer certain, and the future of the universe seemed to be hanging in the balance. As the anomalies continued to intensify and spread across the globe, the team realized that they were running out of time. The disruption of the fundamental particles was not just an academic puzzle, it was a sign of something much larger, something that could threaten the very existence of everything they knew. The universe was no longer the predictable place it once was, and Evelyn knew that they had to act fast before it was too late. They had to find out what was causing the disturbances and stop it before it destroyed everything. Time was running out and the clock was ticking. The team knew they had to act quickly if they wanted to save the universe itself. As Evelyn and her team continued to investigate the strange disturbances that were rapidly altering the very nature of time, a troubling realization began to form. The anomalies, which had initially appeared to be random and isolated, were starting to show signs of being connected by a larger force, something that was beyond their current understanding of the universe. The more they analyzed the data, the more it became clear that there was an unseen hand at work manipulating the flow of time itself. At first, Evelyn and her team thought that the disruptions in time were merely the result of some cosmic accident, an unintended consequence of the universe stretching its limits. However, as they delved deeper into the patterns, they started to recognize that these disturbances were far too deliberate to be random. They followed a consistent trajectory, one that suggested a purposeful force, one that was intentionally manipulating the flow of time in ways that defied the laws of physics. The more they observed, the more it became apparent that whatever this force was, it was not bound by the same physical laws that govern the natural world. The laws of quantum mechanics, gravity, and even the fabric of space-time itself were being bent and twisted by this unseen entity or force. The question on Evelyn's mind and the minds of her team became clear: who or what was behind this disruption? The more they investigated, the more they realized that the disturbance wasn't originating from within their world. They had ruled out natural phenomena, like black holes or cosmic radiation, as the source of the disturbances, as they would not have caused such precise and patterned disruptions in time. Instead, the disturbances seemed to be emanating from a source far beyond their reach, a place or entity that they could not identify. The force behind the anomalies seemed to be able to reach into the very core of time, altering its flow at will. No natural force that they knew of could account for such precise and calculated manipulation. It was as if time itself had become a tool, something that could be shaped and molded by a being or force with a level of power far beyond what humans could comprehend. This new discovery sent shockwaves through the team. If time itself could be manipulated by an external force, then everything they knew about the universe was in jeopardy. Evelyn, always the scientist, tried to remain objective, but the implications of this discovery were staggering. Time was one of the most fundamental aspects of their reality, and if it could be controlled by something outside their understanding, then the very fabric of existence itself could be altered. As the team pieced together the data, they began to notice certain patterns in the disturbances. They were not just random occurrences, but rather they seemed to have an underlying structure, one that suggested a level of control. The force was not merely causing chaos, it was shaping the flow of time, orchestrating events in ways that seemed far too precise to be natural. At first, the team hypothesized that this force could be an extraterrestrial intelligence, a species far more advanced than humanity that had somehow gained control over the fabric of reality itself. The possibility of encountering such a being was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. If there were beings out there who could manipulate time, then the scope of their power was unimaginable. But as they dug deeper into the data, they realized that the disturbance was not just a result of external interference. There were signs that this force had been influencing time for much longer than they had originally thought. The anomalies were not new. They had simply become more noticeable over time as the force behind them grew stronger. There were traces of its influence scattered throughout history, hidden in plain sight. Certain historical events, they realized, had been subtly altered or manipulated by this force, guiding humanity down specific paths. The patterns they had observed in the present were not isolated, but were connected to a much larger, longer-term manipulation of time. This discovery changed everything. The implications were no longer confined to just the present moment. If this force had been influencing time for centuries or even millennia, then the entire course of human history could have been shaped by it. It was as if humanity had been living in a timeline that was being nudged, shifted, and guided by an unseen hand. The force behind the disturbances was not just observing history, it was actively shaping it, altering the very course of human events. Evelyn and her team were faced with a terrifying realization. They were no longer just dealing with a scientific anomaly. They were up against an external force, one that had the power to shape not just the present, but the future as well. The thought that humanity's future could be controlled by such a force sent chills down their spines. The team worked around the clock, trying to gather as much data as possible. They knew they were on the edge of a discovery that could change everything, but they also knew that they were dangerously close to uncovering a force that could destroy everything they held dear. The more they investigated, the more they realized that this force was not just affecting time on Earth. The disturbances were being felt across the entire solar system and possibly beyond. It was as if the influence of this unknown force was rippling outwards, touching every corner of the universe. The implications of this discovery were profound. If this force could control time across the solar system, what was to stop it from affecting the entire universe? The team's sense of urgency grew as they realized that the more they uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. They had to figure out who or what was behind this force before it was too late. Evelyn, who had dedicated her entire life to understanding the nature of time, now faced a question that was far beyond her grasp. What was the ultimate purpose of this force? Was it trying to reshape the universe in its image? Was it trying to destroy humanity? Or was there something more insidious at play? The more they investigated, the more they realized that they might never fully understand the true nature of the force manipulating time. But one thing was clear: it was powerful, it was deliberate, and it was influencing the future of humanity in ways they could not yet comprehend. The clock was ticking, and Evelyn and her team had to act fast to prevent a catastrophe that could rewrite the very fabric of time itself. As the team of researchers continued to explore the strange and unexplainable anomalies affecting time, Jonathan Price, the team's data analyst, made a startling discovery that would change the course of their investigation. For weeks, they had been focused on analyzing the disturbances that were manifesting on Earth: unpredictable shifts in time, strange lapses in memory, and inexplicable alterations in the flow of events. The team was increasingly convinced that these disturbances were not mere coincidences, but something much more profound and perhaps even deliberate. They had already determined that the cause was not an internal issue with the Earth's time-space fabric, but something far more complex and external. Jonathan was analyzing the data streams they had been collecting, scrutinizing everything from timestamps on video recordings to fluctuations in quantum fields when his attention was caught by something unexpected. He had been running simulations on the data coming from deep space observations when a pattern emerged, something that he initially dismissed as an anomaly in the data. But after a closer inspection, he realized it was not a glitch. The readings indicated a continuous signal, a series of strange light pulses emanating from a faraway region in space. These signals, although faint, were unmistakable in their consistency and structure. At first glance, they seemed like nothing more than background noise, just another irregularity in the vast expanse of the universe. But as Jonathan focused more on the details, he noticed a correlation that struck him as too significant to ignore. The signal wasn't random. It wasn't just a cosmic flare or the usual radiation emissions from distant stars. No, this signal followed a precise patterned rhythm, almost as if it were intentional, like a coded message sent across vast distances. Jonathan's heart raced as he cross-checked the timestamps of the signal with the disturbances they had been observing on Earth. To his shock, he found a direct connection. The pulses of light from space were occurring at nearly the exact same moments as the temporal disruptions on Earth. It was as if the signal was in sync with the disturbances, like they were somehow interconnected. His mind raced as he considered the possibilities. Could the signal be the source of the anomalies? Could it be some sort of external force reaching into Earth's time and space, manipulating it? As he reviewed more data, Jonathan began to trace the origin of the signal. It was coming from a distant part of the galaxy, an area so far away that it was beyond the reach of any conventional spacecraft. The light pulses were traveling across light years of empty space, and yet they arrived with pinpoint accuracy, synchronized with the disturbances they had been tracking on Earth. There was no way such a precise signal could be the result of natural cosmic activity. This was no random burst of energy. This was a message, and it was clear that whoever or whatever was sending it knew exactly where to target. Jonathan's discovery was both thrilling and terrifying. The team had been focused on the disturbances occurring on Earth, but now with this new information, it became clear that the anomalies weren't isolated to just their planet. The signal originating from a faraway corner of the universe was somehow reaching them. The implications were staggering. Evelyn Carter, the lead scientist of the group, was immediately called in to review Jonathan's findings. As she examined the data herself, she quickly came to the same conclusion. The signal was not a random occurrence. It was deliberate, Whoever or whatever was sending it was actively trying to communicate, and it was doing so through the very fabric of time itself. The team gathered around the monitors as they studied the data further. They could see the pattern of the signal more clearly now. It wasn't just a burst of energy. It was a series of encoded pulses, a kind of cosmic Morse code. The pattern was consistent, but they couldn't make sense of the message. It was unlike any form of communication they had ever encountered. The signal's rhythm was unlike any known natural phenomenon, and its regularity suggested intelligence behind it. The team speculated that this could be a message from an advanced extraterrestrial civilization, one that had somehow figured out how to manipulate not just space but time as well. As they continued their analysis, they realized that the signal wasn't just a one-time occurrence. It was ongoing, and with each pulse, it seemed to grow stronger, more distinct, as if it was being amplified the closer it got to its destination, Earth. Jonathan and the team worked tirelessly to decode the signal, using all available resources to try to make sense of the pulses. They tried to apply every known method of pattern recognition, but the signal resisted all conventional attempts at decryption. There was something fundamentally different about it. It was clear now that the disturbances they had been tracking on Earth were not random events or natural disasters. They were connected to this signal, and they had to understand its source in order to stop the growing temporal distortions. As the days passed and the signal's strength continued to build, the team's concern grew. The signal was no longer just an isolated event. They now knew that it was part of something much larger, a force that seemed to be reaching out across time and space. And the most unsettling part was that they had no idea what the signal's ultimate purpose was. Was it a warning, a call for help, or something more ominous, an invitation to a force they were ill-prepared to face? The closer they got to understanding the signal, the more questions arose. But one thing was clear: this was not something they could ignore. The connection between the temporal disturbances on Earth and the signal from deep space was undeniable. Whatever was causing the disruptions in time was linked directly to the cosmic signal, and understanding it would be the key to stopping the unraveling of reality itself. The more they delved into the data, the more Evelyn realized that the answers they sought might not be found on Earth at all. The signal was not just some random cosmic event. It was coming from a distant part of the galaxy, a place far beyond their current reach, and whatever it was drawing nearer. The urgency of their mission had never been clearer. Evelyn and her team had to uncover the truth behind the signal and its connection to the disturbances on Earth before it was too late. The very fabric of time itself was at stake, and they were the only ones who could try to stop it. But as they worked to decode the signal, they couldn't shake the growing sense that they were running out of time. The signal was coming faster now, and it seemed like its source had already started to exert its influence on the universe in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The clock was ticking, and the future of humanity and of time itself hung in the balance. As the team continued to investigate the strange temporal anomalies occurring on Earth, they were increasingly confronted with the idea that these disturbances were not simply random fluctuations in the space-time continuum. The precision of the patterns, the synchronization of the anomalies with the signals from deep space, and the undeniable correlation between the events led Evelyn and her team to consider a far more unsettling possibility. The idea that these disturbances were being caused by natural cosmic forces seemed increasingly implausible. There had to be something more behind it, something or someone with the ability to manipulate time itself. As Jonathan Pryce delved deeper into the signal data and cross-referenced it with the temporal shifts they were observing on Earth, he began to see a clearer connection. The signals were not random bursts of energy, but rather systematic pulses that seemed to be timed with an unsettling accuracy. This discovery led the team to develop a hypothesis that was both thrilling and terrifying. The disturbances in time and the signals from space might not be the result of some cosmic anomaly. They might be the work of an extraterrestrial intelligence, a species or civilization capable of manipulating time itself. This idea was not something the team came to lightly. The implications were staggering. If an alien species had the ability to influence time in such a direct way, then the very laws of physics as they understood them could be altered at will. The technology or biological capabilities required to control such a fundamental aspect of the universe would be beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. Evelyn, ever the scientist, found herself grappling with the possibility. She had spent her life studying the nature of time, and now the very concept she had spent years understanding seemed to be unraveling before her eyes. The thought of extraterrestrial life being capable of such power was both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling. The team began to hypothesize that the signals emanating from deep space could be the result of a species with technology so advanced that they were able to harness and control time as if it were just another resource. The question then became not just what was happening, but who or what was behind it. The more they studied the signal, the more they realized that this alien force, or potentially a technologically advanced species, had been manipulating time for longer than they had initially thought. The patterns in the disturbances suggested a deliberate and calculated effort to alter the course of history. The team was faced with the terrifying possibility that humanity's timeline was not as it seemed. What if their history had been shaped, directed, or even controlled by an extraterrestrial force? The more they thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together. There were moments throughout history that had always seemed odd or out of place. Events that had seemed to change the course of humanity unexpectedly. What if those events were not just coincidences, but instead the result of this alien influence carefully orchestrated to guide humanity in specific directions? It was a chilling thought. Evelyn had always believed that humanity's fate was in its own hands, that history was shaped by the choices of people. But now they were facing the disturbing possibility that their choices might not be their own at all. Perhaps these aliens were guiding human history, manipulating time to ensure that certain outcomes were achieved. The idea of an alien intelligence influencing the course of history raised a host of questions. If this was true, why were they doing it? What was their end goal? Were they shaping humanity's evolution for their own purposes, or was there a greater purpose at play, one that they had not yet understood? The team also considered the possibility that the signals were not a form of communication in the traditional sense, but rather a method of controlling or influencing the events that were unfolding on Earth. If an alien civilization had the technology to control time, they might not need to directly communicate with humanity. Instead, they could be using time itself as a medium for their influence, guiding events without ever revealing their true presence. The team's research into the signals took on new urgency, as they realized that they were not just studying a cosmic anomaly, they were potentially uncovering the existence of an advanced extraterrestrial civilization with the power to control the very fabric of time. This thought both thrilled and terrified them. If these beings could manipulate time, then the consequences for humanity were unknown. The team began to wonder if this was the reason for the temporal disturbances. They were perhaps witnessing the early stages of an alien intervention in human history. The signals were not just strange bursts of energy, they were a deliberate manipulation of the time-space continuum, a signal sent by an intelligence far beyond human understanding. With this new hypothesis in mind, the team focused their efforts on understanding the true nature of the signals. They worked tirelessly to decode the pulses, searching for any pattern or message that might give them more insight into the alien influence at play. The more they analyzed, the more they came to realize that the signals were not just a series of random energy bursts, but a structured and purposeful communication. They were not simply trying to communicate with humanity, they were influencing the very flow of time itself. The discovery was both exciting and terrifying. If an alien species had mastered the ability to manipulate time, what else were they capable of? The team began to consider the possibility that this was not just an accidental intervention. Perhaps humanity had been under the influence of this alien force for much longer than they had imagined. The history of humanity could have been shaped by these extraterrestrial beings who had used their advanced technology to guide the course of events. If this were true, then the timeline that humanity had followed was not one of their own making. It was the result of an alien hand shaping the course of history. The team was left with more questions than answers. What did these aliens want with humanity? Were they trying to shape humanity's future for their own benefit, or was there a greater purpose they had not yet uncovered? The more they thought about it, the more they realized that they were on the brink of discovering something far more profound than they had originally anticipated. The truth behind the signal and the possibility of an extraterrestrial force manipulating time could change the course of human history forever. Evelyn and her team were no longer just studying an anomaly. They were uncovering a force that could reshape everything they had ever known, and they knew they had to find out more before it was too late. Time itself might be under their control, and if that was the case, they would need to act quickly to prevent further disruptions in the timeline. The fate of humanity and perhaps the entire universe might depend on it. As the team continued their investigation into the strange disturbances affecting time, they began to observe a troubling trend. What had initially started as isolated events in small remote areas was now spreading to larger and more populous regions. The temporal anomalies that had once seemed like anomalies confined to specific locations were now showing up in major cities around the world, affecting millions of people. What began as subtle disturbances now became more pronounced and frequent. People were no longer just experiencing brief moments of déjà vu or small lapses in memory. Entire communities were being affected as individuals began to notice entire days or weeks repeating themselves as if they were trapped in a loop. The once isolated events were becoming global, and the frequency of these disturbances was increasing with alarming speed. At first, it was a localized phenomenon. Small towns, remote villages, and isolated research stations were the first to experience the strange shifts in time. These disturbances were small, and while they were alarming, they did not yet seem to pose an existential threat. But as the team analyzed the data, they quickly realized that these anomalies were not just affecting small areas anymore. The disruptions were beginning to spread into larger cities, affecting millions of people. In some cities like New York, London, and Tokyo, the effects were so widespread that entire blocks of people seemed to experience the same event at the same time. These were not just coincidences or moments of collective déjà vu. People were living through the same events again and again, as if time itself was being rewound and replayed. People who had never met before were suddenly having the same conversations, performing the same actions, and even experiencing the same emotions, as though they had lived through the exact same moments before. It wasn't just isolated incidents either. In some parts of the world, the temporal disturbances were happening on a scale that was hard to ignore. Major cities were beginning to experience periods where time seemed to stand still or move backward, causing widespread confusion and panic. The local authorities were overwhelmed, and people began to report strange occurrences like hearing their own voices from a few minutes earlier or seeing people they had already passed earlier in the day. These events were not just happening in one city, but in multiple cities at once. What was even more troubling was that the disruptions in time were starting to affect critical systems, transportation networks, financial markets, communication systems. All of these were starting to show signs of being manipulated by the temporal anomalies. In some instances, flights would be delayed or rerouted only to have the same flight come through a few hours later, as if it had never been delayed in the first place. The global stock markets were in chaos as prices fluctuated unpredictably, with stocks rising and falling in ways that defied logic and time itself. What seemed like a fleeting moment of confusion or a strange coincidence was now becoming a daily occurrence, and the people of the world were starting to question what was real and what was not. The phenomenon was no longer just affecting a small group of researchers or isolated towns. It was beginning to unravel the very fabric of society itself. In one of the most bizarre incidents, a group of people in a subway station in New York City experienced the same event multiple times in a row. They would board the train, travel to the same station, and then the train would stop only to have them repeat the exact same series of events again. Passengers would board the train, make the same conversations, and experience the same emotions as if the whole event was being reset. This wasn't just a temporary glitch in time, it was a permanent loop that was taking hold. What was even more troubling was that people were starting to notice the effects. Some began to question whether they were stuck in a nightmare or trapped in some kind of time prison. Others tried to escape by leaving the cities, hoping to find areas that hadn't been affected by the disturbances. But wherever they went, the events would follow them. The anomalies were not confined to specific locations. They were affecting the entire planet. The team, now fully aware of the scale of the crisis, began to reanalyze their previous findings. The temporal disturbances had become so frequent and widespread that they no longer felt like isolated incidents. The anomalies were now part of a much larger pattern that seemed to be growing stronger. With each passing day, Evelyn and her team were forced to consider a terrifying new possibility. The disturbances weren't just random, they were happening for a reason, and the purpose behind them was still unknown. But there was one thing they were certain of: the longer they waited, the more difficult it would become to contain the effects of these anomalies. Time itself was starting to unravel, and they were beginning to see the terrifying consequences of these disturbances. As they continued to gather data and study the anomalies, it became clear that the disturbances weren't just random glitches or accidents. They were part of a much larger pattern, a pattern that was growing more pronounced and widespread every day. The temporal anomalies had become a global phenomenon, and the impact on society was becoming catastrophic. The disruption in the flow of time was not just causing confusion and panic, it was affecting the very foundation of reality itself. The laws of physics as they understood them were starting to break down, and the world was slowly but surely being torn apart. People were no longer able to trust their own experiences, and the very nature of existence was being called into question. As the team continued to investigate the source of the disturbances, they realized that they were no longer just dealing with a scientific anomaly. They were dealing with a phenomenon that had the potential to reshape reality itself. The increase in the frequency and intensity of the temporal disturbances was making it clear that the world was on the brink of collapse. The fabric of time, once thought to be stable and immutable, was now in danger of completely unraveling. Evelyn and her team were facing a race against time, but the problem was they didn't know if they could stop the anomalies in time. Every hour that passed brought them closer to a reality where time no longer behaved according to the rules they had always known. The world they had once known was slowly slipping away, and they didn't know if they could fix it before it was too late. The situation was growing more urgent, and the effects of the disturbances were beginning to reach a critical point. As cities, nations, and continents all experienced the growing chaos caused by the disruptions in time, the team knew that their work had never been more important. The future of humanity and the survival of the world depended on their ability to understand the cause of these disturbances before time itself ceased to exist as they knew it. The very nature of reality was at stake, and the pressure was mounting as the team raced against time to uncover the truth behind the temporal anomalies. As the temporal disturbances continued to increase in both frequency and intensity, Evelyn and her team found themselves at a critical juncture. The data they had been collecting for weeks had painted a troubling picture, one that suggested that the very fabric of time itself was being manipulated by an unseen force. The more they investigated, the more it became clear that this wasn't just a series of isolated events. It was part of a larger coordinated disruption that spanned not just Earth, but extended out into space. The evidence they had gathered pointed toward a singular conclusion: something or someone was intentionally altering the flow of time. This realization left them with a singular, daunting task. They needed to understand the source of these disturbances and, if possible, find a way to stop it. Before the fabric of reality unraveled entirely, Evelyn knew that they had to act quickly. Time was no longer a predictable force. It had become something malleable, something that could be bent and twisted by an unknown power. The temporal anomalies were no longer just odd occurrences. They were signs of a much deeper problem. If they didn't find the source of these disturbances soon, they could lose control of time itself. With this in mind, the team decided to embark on a journey to uncover the truth behind the disturbances and the strange signals they had discovered coming from deep space. They could no longer afford to stay in one place, studying data from afar. They needed to be at the forefront of the anomalies, witnessing them firsthand in order to understand them. Their journey would take them to locations across the world where the disturbances were most concentrated, as well as to the outer reaches of space where the signals were originating. The first step was to travel to the remote areas on Earth where the time anomalies had been the most pronounced. These were the places where time itself seemed to collapse in on itself, causing people to experience entire days or weeks on repeat. It was there that they hoped to find clues that would lead them to the source of the disturbances. As they traveled, they began to see firsthand the scale of the problem. In the small towns and isolated villages where the disturbances were most acute, time had become a fluid, unpredictable entity. People were experiencing strange loops in time, with whole communities trapped in repeating cycles of the same events. Some would remember events happening multiple times. Others would feel as if they were living through the same day again and again. The sense of confusion and disorientation was palpable. It wasn't just the towns they visited. The phenomena were spreading. The disturbances were no longer isolated to small regions. They were beginning to affect larger cities where millions of people were now experiencing these strange temporal loops. The more they explored, the more they realized that they were dealing with something much bigger than they had initially thought. Time, once thought to be a fixed and unchangeable force, was now a chaotic and volatile element, subject to manipulation by forces beyond their control. But it wasn't just the disturbances on Earth that were of concern. The team had also discovered signals emanating from deep space signals that were somehow connected to the disturbances. These signals, though faint, were unmistakably deliberate. They seemed to be coming from a distant part of the galaxy far beyond the reach of human technology. As they followed the signals, they began to piece together a frightening theory. What if the disturbances were not random? What if they were being controlled by an advanced intelligence, one capable of manipulating time itself? The idea that an extraterrestrial civilization could be behind the disturbances sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. The thought that an alien species had the power to manipulate time to control the very flow of reality was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The team's journey took them to some of the most isolated and remote places on Earth, places where the disturbances were strongest. There they began to witness firsthand the effects of time manipulation. In one small town, people had been living the same day over and over again, unable to break free from the loop. In another, the local power grid seemed to be operating in reverse, with time literally flowing backward for hours at a time. Each location they visited revealed new and disturbing information about the nature of the disturbances, but the source remained elusive. The deeper they delved into the mystery, the more they realized that they weren't just facing a simple scientific anomaly. They were up against something far more complex, something that might change the way they understood the universe itself. They needed to understand what was behind the temporal anomalies, what was causing time itself to behave in ways that were impossible to explain. The team had already ruled out natural explanations, such as gravitational anomalies or cosmic radiation. The disturbances were too specific, too deliberate to be the result of any natural force. They had also considered the possibility that the disturbances could be a result of human experimentation gone wrong, but the more they analyzed the data, the less likely that seemed. The anomalies were too precise, too coordinated to be the result of a simple mistake. The team now faced a difficult choice where to go next. They had exhausted their resources on Earth, and the disturbances were growing worse with every passing day. If they were to find the answers they needed, they would have to look beyond Earth, beyond the solar system itself. The signals from deep space were growing stronger, and the team knew that they had to follow them. The answers lay out there somewhere in the vastness of the universe. But as they prepared for their next phase of the investigation, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were not just seeking answers, they were walking into a trap. Whoever or whatever was behind the disturbances had been waiting for them to come this far. They had been luring them in using the temporal anomalies as bait. The team was now on the brink of discovering something far greater than they had ever imagined. But the question remained, would they be able to handle the truth once they found it? As they prepared to embark on their journey to unravel the mystery of the disturbances, the team was filled with a sense of urgency. They knew that time was running out. If they didn't act quickly, the very fabric of reality could be destroyed. They had no choice but to continue the journey to follow the signals wherever they led and to find the source of the disturbances before it was too late. But they also knew that the further they ventured into the unknown, the more dangerous their mission would become. The source of the temporal anomalies was out there somewhere, and they were determined to find it. As Evelyn and her team stood at the edge of the cliff, looking up at the strange light in the sky, they couldn't help but feel a mixture of awe and terror. For weeks, they had been investigating the temporal anomalies that had been spreading across the world, hoping to find answers. But now they realized they had barely scratched the surface. The light in the sky was not just a visual phenomenon, It was something far more significant, something that seemed to be connected to the very source of the disturbances they had been tracking. The signal from deep space, the strange disturbances in time, and the sudden appearance of this light in the sky all seemed to be linked in some way that no one could fully comprehend. The team had come so far, gathered so much data, and uncovered so many unsettling truths, but they were still left with the most important question of all. What was the true nature of the force behind these anomalies, and what did it want? Evelyn stared up at the light, her mind racing as she tried to piece together the fragments of information they had gathered. Could it be that this light was a signal, a beacon from the alien civilization? They had theorized about the same force that had been manipulating time for so long. If that was the case, what did it mean for humanity? What was the purpose behind these manipulations of time, and what consequences would it have on the future of mankind? The questions were overwhelming, and Evelyn felt the weight of them pressing down on her shoulders. She had spent her life studying the nature of time, but now she was faced with a reality that defied everything she had ever believed. The very laws of physics seemed to be breaking down, and the timeline of humanity itself was being manipulated by forces beyond their control. Her team standing beside her shared the same sense of uncertainty. They had been following the data, collecting evidence, and making groundbreaking discoveries, but they knew that the answers they sought were far from clear. The disturbances were not just random occurrences, they were orchestrated, deliberate, and had a purpose. But what that purpose was remained a mystery. The more they uncovered, the more they realized how little they truly understood about what was happening. Was this light a warning, a call for help, or an invitation to something far more dangerous? Were they meant to stop the manipulations, or was there a greater force at play that they had no hope of defeating? These were questions that plagued their minds, and the answers seemed to lie just beyond their reach. The light in the sky seemed to pulse with energy, as if it were alive, as if it were aware of their presence. Evelyn's heart raced as she wondered whether they were truly ready for what was coming. Could they protect humanity from the forces that were pulling at the very fabric of time? Could they prevent the manipulation of history, the rewriting of the future? Could they stop the alien intelligence, or whatever it was that seemed to be orchestrating the temporal disturbances? She knew they were facing something far beyond their current understanding, something that could change the course of human history forever. The light in the sky with its eerie glow was a reminder that time itself was no longer the stable, predictable force it had once been. It was something fluid, something that could be altered, manipulated, and shaped by powers that were beyond their comprehension. Evelyn turned to her team, her eyes filled with determination and fear. They had come so far, but the journey was far from over. They had uncovered the existence of a force that could control time itself, but they had no idea what it wanted or how to stop it. The stakes had never been higher, and they were running out of time, literally. With each passing moment, the disturbances were growing stronger, and the light in the sky seemed to be a beacon, calling them to face whatever force was behind it. The question that loomed large in their minds was not just about understanding the phenomenon, it was about survival. Could they stop the manipulation of time before it was too late? Could they protect humanity from a fate that they couldn't yet fully grasp? Could they, in the end, preserve the freedom of humankind? Or would they become pawns in a cosmic game that they had no hope of winning? Evelyn knew that the future of humanity rested on their shoulders, and yet as she gazed up at the strange light, she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers they sought were just the beginning of a much darker journey. They had uncovered a force that could alter time itself, but the true consequences of its power were still unknown. She turned back to her team, a sense of urgency growing inside her. They had to find a way to stop this before the light consumed everything they knew. The fate of the world and the future of humanity hung in the balance.